Sit down. You can't stand here. You don't even belong here, and you're causing a nuisance already. The flight attendant, Meredith shouted angrily to the black woman in first class. The flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face flushed with anger. I said, "Sit down," she snapped and physically pushed Eleanor's shoulder, forcing her back into her seat while spilling a pitcher of water on her. Eleanor, the black woman, soaking wet from the water deliberately spilled on her designer suit, was publicly bared in front of an entire first-class cabin. Not a single passenger came to her defense. Not a single airline staff member offered assistance. Instead, all eyes judged her as the problem. You people need to learn your place. The flight attendant had hissed loud enough for everyone to hear. What the flight attendant didn't know, what nobody on that flight knew, was exactly who she was speaking to, and the power that woman held in her weathered hands. The moment everything changed came with a simple call, spoken with the quiet authority that could only come from decades on the federal bench. One phone call, one command, and the airline was brought to its knees. It was a scene of unprecedented chaos, a major airline completely grounded. Every single flight canceled. Thousands of passengers stranded. News crews swarmed like bees around a corporate crisis. All because one woman, one powerful woman, decided enough was enough. If you've ever been disrespected, overlooked, or treated unfairly because of who you are, and you stand against injustice, type power in the comments and tell us what country you're watching from. Today's story wasn't just about what happened on Flight 2187. It was about the moment when systemic discrimination met its match in federal judge Eleanor Washington, a woman who had spent her life working within the system to change it until the day the system pushed her too far. Before we dive deep into the events that led to this extraordinary moment, take a second to like this video and hit that notification bell because the justice that was served is something you won't want to miss. This story began on what should have been a routine Tuesday morning at Atlanta International Airport. Judge Eleanor Washington had just wrapped up a grueling 3-week civil rights case, a landmark decision that would help countless families fight housing discrimination. She was exhausted but satisfied with the verdict she delivered. Little did she know that her greatest test of justice wouldn't come in her courtroom. But in the first-class cabin of Flight 2187, Judge Eleanor Washington stood in the priority boarding line, her posture impeccable despite her exhaustion. At 62, she carried herself with the dignified bearing that came from over 2 decades on the federal bench. Her silver-streaked natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her conservative navy pantsuit crisp despite the humidity of an Atlanta summer morning. The weight of the past 3 weeks showed only in the slight shadows beneath her eyes, remnants of the marathon civil rights case she'd just presided over. In her weathered leather briefcase, she carried the final opinion she'd handed down just yesterday, a landmark ruling that would protect hundreds of families from housing discrimination. It had been grueling but necessary work. Now all she wanted was to return to Washington, D.C. and finally get a full night's sleep in her own bed. As the first-class passengers began boarding Flight 2187, inside the airplane, flight attendant Meredith Keller was already in a foul mood. At 34, the blonde attendant had been with the airline for nearly a decade, and she'd started the morning by venting to her colleagues in the galley. "Did you see how many special requests we have in first class today?" She'd complained, making air quotes around the words. "These entitled passengers think we're their personal servants, especially the ones who clearly don't belong up front." Her colleague had nodded sympathetically, neither of them aware that their casual prejudice would soon have extraordinary consequences. The first-class cabin of Flight 2187 presented a familiar scene. Predominantly white male business travelers in crisp suits, their importance announced by their Rolex watches and confident demeanors. Laptops open before takeoff, important calls being squeezed in until the last possible moment. The cabin hummed with privilege and entitlement. Judge Washington made her way down the aisle with practiced efficiency, finding her seat 3C, a nice seat she'd specifically requested to accommodate her occasional need to stretch due to circulation issues. The older white businessman in 3D glanced up briefly from his Wall Street Journal. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly as she settled in beside him. He shifted slightly toward the window, creating an extra inch of space between them. It was a small gesture, nearly invisible to anyone not watching for it, but Eleanor noticed. After 6 decades as a black woman in America, 4 decades in the legal profession, and over 20 years on the federal bench, she had developed a radar for these subtle signals of discomfort and bias. The pre-boarding service began. Eleanor watched as Meredith moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, offering warm towels and pre-departure beverages with cheerful banter to each passenger. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris. Lovely to see you again." Your usual scotch before takeoff. Each interaction was personalized, warm, attentive until Meredith reached row 3. "Water, please," Eleanor said politely when Meredith finally made eye contact. "Room temperature if possible." But instead of responding, Meredith's gaze slid past Eleanor to the man in 3D. "Good afternoon, sir. May I offer you a beverage before we depart?" The businessman ordered a bourbon, received it promptly with a warm smile and cloth napkin, while Eleanor's request hung in the air unacknowledged. This wasn't the first time Eleanor had experienced such treatment, and in the normal course of events, she might have simply repeated her request or flagged down another flight attendant. But today's events would prove anything but normal. Minutes passed. The cabin door was about to close. Eleanor raised her hand slightly to catch Meredith's attention as she passed by again. "Excuse me, I had asked for water earlier." Meredith's smile tightened. "We're preparing for departure now. I'll have to get that for you once we're in the air." Yet, just 30 seconds later, Eleanor watched as Meredith hurried to bring a last-minute coffee to a white passenger in 2B. The pattern was establishing itself, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of discrimination that doesn't announce itself with slurs or direct refusals, but with selective attentiveness and the quiet withholding of standard courtesies. The kind that leaves its targets questioning whether they're being oversensitive, even when they know in their bones exactly what's happening. The businessman beside Eleanor shifted again, angling his newspaper to create an even more pronounced barrier between them. Eleanor noticed his wedding ring as he moved, a simple gold band that matched the photo of his family visible on his phone screen. A wife, 2 teenage daughters, a golden retriever, a man whose life likely never required him to think about the subtle indignities others face daily. Eleanor took a deep breath and returned to her briefs. The Anderson case had been particularly challenging, a complex web of housing discrimination allegations that had required her to parse through decades of municipal zoning decisions. She had ultimately found in favor of the plaintiffs a group of black families who had systematically been denied access to neighborhoods with better schools and services. The irony wasn't lost on her as she sat herself denied the simple courtesy of a glass of water, focused instead on the documents detailing her decision that would help countless families get fair treatment. As the safety demonstration began, Meredith made deliberate eye contact with each passenger during her demonstration. Each passenger except Eleanor. Another small slight barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but Eleanor noticed. She always noticed. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and began its ascent into the clouds. The small slights were adding up one after another like drops of water slowly filling a bucket. How many small indignities could one person endure before finally saying, "Enough"? For Judge Eleanor Washington, that moment was coming. And when it arrived, nothing in the airline industry would ever be the same. If you've ever been in a situation where you've been treated differently because of who you are, share your thoughts in the comments and click on the subscribe button now to enjoy more of these stories. As Flight 2187 climbed to cruising altitude, a pattern was beginning to emerge, one that Judge Eleanor Washington recognized all too well. The safety demonstration began with Meredith standing in the aisle demonstrating the oxygen mask procedure. "Make sure to secure your own mask before assisting others," she instructed, making deliberate eye contact with each passenger as she moved through her rehearsed script. Each passenger, that is, except Eleanor. When Meredith reached row 3, her gaze pointedly skipped over the judge, landing on the businessman in 3D with a warm smile before continuing down the aisle. It was the kind of subtle exclusion that most passengers wouldn't notice, but Eleanor did. It was a familiar feeling, being rendered invisible in a space where everyone else was seen. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the drink service began. Meredith moved methodically through the first-class cabin, her customer service persona in full effect as she took orders and delivered beverages with practice efficiency. "Sparkling water for you, sir. Here's your scotch on the rocks, Mr. Peterson." When she reached Eleanor's row, the judge repeated her earlier request. "May I please have some water? Room temperature if possible." Meredith's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll get to you shortly," she said before continuing to the next row. 10 minutes passed. The beverage cart had made its way through the entire first-class cabin. Every passenger had been served their drink of choice. Every passenger except Eleanor. As Meredith passed by again, Eleanor raised her hand slightly. Excuse me, I believe you forgot my water. Meredith didn't even slow her stride. I'll have to come back. You'll have to wait. I'm serving priority customers first. Priority customers. The implication hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. The businessman across the aisle smirked, his expression reflecting a toxic familiarity with such coded language. It was a moment of silent complicity that Eleanor had witnessed countless times throughout her life. The shared understanding between those who discriminate and those who benefit from that discrimination. Finally, after serving everyone else refills, Meredith returned with Eleanor's water, a half-filled plastic cup, no ice, no napkin, placed it on her armrest with barely a glance. Meanwhile, the white passengers around her enjoyed full glasses, linen napkins, and small dishes of mixed nuts. The pattern continued as the flight progressed. When meal service began, the flight attendants distributed meals based on the passengers' pre-selected preferences. Eleanor had requested a vegetarian meal when booking her ticket, a detail noted in her reservation, just like any other dietary accommodation. "I'm sorry," Meredith said when she reached Eleanor's row, her tone suggesting she was anything but sorry. "We don't have any special meals left." Eleanor glanced around the cabin. There were only 16 seats in first class, and she could clearly see that no more than half of them had been served. "I requested a vegetarian meal when I booked my ticket," Eleanor explained calmly. "Could you please check again?" "Ma'am, if I said we don't have any left, we don't have any left," Meredith responded, her voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You'll have to make do with what we have available." What was available turned out to be the leftover bread roll and side salad from the regular meal served without dressing, utensils, or the Houghton tree that every other passenger received. As Eleanor attempted to make the best of her limited meal, she discovered her tray table was uneven, tilting dangerously to one side. When she called Meredith's attention to the issue, the flight attendant's response was immediate and dismissive. "It's not my job to fix equipment," she said loudly. "You'll have to manage." Eleanor glanced around, noticing that several passengers were watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. Not one spoke up. The cramped conditions were becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Eleanor, who was dealing with circulation issues after the long trial. When she noticed an empty aisle seat a few rows ahead, she gathered her belongings to relocate. Before she could even fully stand, Meredith's voice cut across the cabin. "All passengers must remain in their assigned seats for the duration of the flight. It's airline policy." Eleanor returned to her seat, only to watch in disbelief as not 5 minutes later, a white businessman requested to move to a different seat, the very one Eleanor had attempted to take, and was cheerfully accommodated by Meredith. "Of course, sir. Let me help you with your belongings," Meredith offered, rushing to assist him. The double standard was no longer subtle. It was blatant, unmistakable, and witnessed by everyone in the first-class cabin. Yet still, Noon spoke up. As the flight continued, Eleanor attempted to distract herself with the in-flight entertainment system, only to find her screen frozen. She pressed the call button once, twice, 3 times over the span of 15 minutes. Each time the button lit up, but Meredith walked past repeatedly, deliberately ignoring the summons. Eleanor overheard Meredith comment to a nearby passenger as she refilled his drink. "Some people just want constant attention," she said loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "They think pressing that button makes them special." The man chuckled in response, another moment of complicity that burned in Eleanor's awareness. The cabin experienced moderate turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to illuminate. For 20 minutes, everyone remained secured in their seats as the plane navigated rough air. When the captain finally turned off the seatbelt sign, there was a collective rustling throughout the cabin as passengers stretched and moved to the lavatories. Eleanor had been waiting for this moment. Her medication for high blood pressure was in her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. Medication she should have taken 30 minutes ago. She stood carefully, reaching for the overhead bin. Before she could open it, Meredith's voice cut through the cabin like a whip. "Ma'am, sit down now." The command was loud, sharp, and delivered in a tone one might use with a misbehaving child. The entire cabin fell silent. "I need to retrieve my medication," Eleanor explained calmly, her voice measured despite this humiliation of being spoken to in such a manner. "The seatbelt sign is off." "The turbulence could return at any moment," Meredith insisted. "You need to return to your seat immediately." Eleanor gestured to the other passengers who were standing and moving about the cabin. "Others are up and moving around. I simply need to get my medication." The surrounding passengers began to mumble, but not in support of Eleanor. Instead, There were grumbles about rule breakers and difficult passengers. A businessman across the aisle, who had himself just returned from the lavatory, shook his head in disapproval. "Just listen to the staff lady," he said dismissively. "They're just doing their job." Eleanor took a deep breath. 62 years of carefully choosing her battles, of maintaining her dignity in the face of disrespect, of working within a system that had never fully welcomed her. All of it coalesced in this moment. She stood again, reaching once more for her medication. What happened next changed everything. Meredith rushed down the aisle, her face flushed with anger. "I said sit down!" She snapped and physically pushed Eleanor's shoulder, forcing her back into her seat. The water pitcher Meredith was carrying tilted as she pushed Eleanor, sending a cascade of ice-cold water across the judge's lap and onto the legal documents in her open briefcase. Eleanor gasped as the cold water soaked through her suit and onto her skin. The papers from the Anderson case now swimming in a puddle on her lap. Instead of apologizing, Meredith turned to address the cabin at large. "I apologize for the disturbance, folks," she announced, as if Eleanor had been the one to cause a scene rather than the victim of assault and property damage. The cabin erupted in complaints, not about Meredith's behavior, but about the disruption Eleanor had supposedly caused. The collective gaslighting was breathtaking in its completeness. "These people always have to make a scene," someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Eleanor sat in shocked silence, water dripping from her soaked clothing and ruined documents. Not a single napkin was offered. Not a word of apology was spoken. "May I please go to the lavatory to clean up?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. Meredith blocked the pathway. "Return to your seat immediately," she commanded. "We're experiencing turbulence." The seatbelt sign remained off. Other passengers continued to move freely about the cabin, understanding that this situation had moved well beyond casual discrimination into something far more serious. Eleanor quietly took out her phone and began documenting what had occurred, typing notes with timestamps and details of each incident. Meredith noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I'm making notes," Eleanor replied calmly. "No unauthorized recordings on this aircraft," Meredith declared, snatching the phone from Eleanor's hands. "This is a security violation." "That is my personal property," Eleanor said, her voice finally showing the first edge of the anger she had been containing. "You have no right to take it." "I'll hold on to this until we land," Meredith said, pocketing the phone. "Airline procedure." The lead flight attendant, Davis, approached, having been summoned by Meredith. Rather than assessing the situation objectively, he immediately backed his colleague. "We have procedures, ma'am," he said condescendingly. "For the safety of all passengers." The final indignity came when the captain's voice sounded over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with an unruly passenger situation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened while our crew handles this matter." Unruly passenger? The label hung in the air, attaching itself to Eleanor in the minds of everyone on board. The complete inversion of reality, painting the victim as the aggressor, was a familiar tactic that Eleanor had seen deployed countless times in her career, but never so brazenly against her personally. As she sat there soaking wet, her property confiscated, labeled as unruly for simply requesting the same treatment afforded to every other passenger, something shifted in Judge Eleanor Washington's mind. This was no longer about a glass of water or a meal preference, or even the indignity of being pushed. This was about a system that allowed such treatment to occur without consequence, a system that presumed guilt based on appearance, a system that needed correction. Eleanor reached for her briefcase again, her expression changing from patience to resolve. In that moment, every passenger who had smirked, every colleague who had remained silent, and especially Meredith herself, none of them had any idea who they were dealing with or what was about to happen next. If you were in Eleanor's shoes, what would you have done at this point? Share in the comments and hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next in this story is one you won't want to miss. Soaking wet, publicly humiliated, and labeled as unruly to an entire cabin of passengers who had witnessed her mistreatment without intervention, Judge Eleanor Washington sat perfectly still for precisely 10 seconds. 10 seconds to consider the weight of what was about to happen. 10 seconds to decide if this was finally a battle worth fighting. In those 10 seconds, she thought of every black woman who had ever swallowed her dignity to avoid making a scene. She thought of the Anderson family whose housing discrimination case she just ruled on. Ordinary people who had the courage to demand justice when the system failed them. Then, with the deliberate calmness that had made her reputation in the courtroom, Eleanor reached for her briefcase. Meredith noticed immediately. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Eleanor moving deliberately despite the unruly passenger designation that should have immobilized her. "Put that away or I'll confiscate it too," she threatened, her voice carrying through the now silent cabin. The threat hung in the air, bold, inappropriate, and the final mistake in a series that would change both their lives forever. Eleanor rose from her seat, water still dripping from her soaked suit onto the airplane carpet. But something fundamental had changed. Her posture, already dignified, now radiated an unmistakable authority. Her expression, previously patient, now carried the weight of judgment. The same woman who had been invisible to the flight crew moments before now commanded the complete attention of everyone in the cabin. She extracted from her briefcase a small leather wallet that contained her federal judiciary credentials. The gold seal of the United States courts caught the cabin light as she held it up, not dramatically, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ounce of the authority it represented. "I am Federal Judge Eleanor Washington of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia," she announced, her voice clear and measured. Every syllable carried the weight of her 20-year tenure on the federal bench. Each word was delivered with the precise diction that had made her known for opinions that were impossible to misinterpret. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to dim in deference to the revelation unfolding. Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed directly on Meredith. "Not only have you discriminated against me based on my race, you have now physically assaulted a federal judge, confiscated my personal property without cause, and interfered with official judicial business by damaging court documents." She gestured to the water-soaked papers still visible in her open briefcase. Documents from the Anderson case that represented justice for families who had fought discrimination for years. Meredith's face drained of color so rapidly that a passenger would later compare it to watching someone pull a plug in a sink. The smug confidence that had carried her through hours of discriminatory behavior evaporated in an instant. She looked to lead flight attendant Davis for support, but he had taken a step back, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Eleanor reached into her briefcase again and removed a small black device, her government-issued secure phone. Unlike her personal phone that Meredith had confiscated, this one carried the full weight of federal authority. It was meant for judicial emergencies and communication with law enforcement. Today, it would serve another kind of justice. "This is Judge Washington," she said into the phone, her voice now carrying the tone she reserved for delivering verdicts. "Connect me to Chairwoman Richards immediately." The name dropped into the silence of the cabin like a stone into still water, creating ripples of confusion among the passengers, but a tsunami of panic in the flight crew. Meredith leaned toward Davis, trying to whisper, but failing to modulate her voice in her panic. "Who's Chairwoman Richards?" The question betrayed both her fear and her sudden realization that she had waded into waters far deeper than she had imagined. Davis's face had gone completely pale, his earlier confidence replaced by the look of someone who suddenly realized they were standing on the tracks with a train approaching. "Margaret Richards," he replied, his voice barely audible but carrying in the silent cabin. "Head of the National Airline Association. She outranks everyone, including our CEO." The realization of just who they had mistreated began to spread through the cabin like a cold wind. Passengers who'd smirked or turned away earlier now sat rigidly in their seats, eyes forward, uncomfortable witnesses to the consequences that were about to unfold. The businessman who had told Eleanor to just listen to the staff was now intently studying his shoes. "Margaret." Eleanor spoke into the phone, her tone shifting to one of colleagues who understood each other's authority. There was a history in that single-word greeting, a relationship between two powerful women who had navigated male-dominated industries and emerged as leaders. "I'm experiencing something on Flight 2187 that requires immediate intervention." The conversation that followed was brief but powerful. Those closest to Eleanor could hear only her side, but it was enough to understand that wheels of consequence were now in unstoppable motion. Yes, physical contact was made. No, not a single intervention from staff or passengers. The documents from the Anderson case have been damaged. I believe this is indicative of a systemic issue, not an isolated incident. I agree completely. That would be appropriate. Yes, I'll remain on board until they arrive. When she ended the call, Eleanor turned to face Meredith directly. The transformation was complete. Gone was any trace of the patient passenger who'd endured humiliation. In her place stood the full embodiment of federal judicial authority, the same presence that had made guilty defendants confess and hardened attorneys stammer in her courtroom. "You have exactly 3 minutes to return my property and provide your full employee information." Eleanor stated her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. Each word was delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to having their orders followed. "This aircraft will be landing at the nearest available airport, where representatives from both the airline's executive leadership and the Federal Aviation Administration will be waiting." Meredith's hands visibly shook as she retrieved Eleanor's personal phone from her pocket and extended it, no longer able to meet the judge's eyes. "This is all a misunderstanding," she attempted, her voice trembling as the gravity of her actions began to dawn on her. "If I had known who you were." Eleanor cut her off with a single raised hand, the same gesture she used to silence interruptions in her courtroom. The effect was immediate and complete. "That is precisely the problem, Miss Keller. Justice should not depend on knowing someone's title or position. Basic human dignity is not reserved for those with authority." In that moment, Eleanor Washington wasn't just speaking to Meredith. She was addressing every person who had ever used someone's perceived lack of status as permission to treat them poorly. She was speaking to a culture that required credentials before conferring respect. She was articulating a principle that would soon become the cornerstone of industry-wide reform. The cabin remained in shocked silence as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been instructed to divert to Charlotte Douglas International Airport. We'll be beginning our descent shortly. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." The confusion that spread through the cabin was palpable. Passengers checked their watches and phones, calculating delays to their schedules, entirely unaware that they were witnessing something far more significant than a flight diversion. They were watching the moment when discrimination met justice. Eleanor returned to her seat, sitting tall despite her wet clothing. Not a single passenger made eye contact with her now, not out of dismissal, but out of a dawning realization of their own complicity in what they had witnessed and failed to address. Today, Eleanor had honored the legacy of using her position to demand that respect be given not just to those with power, but to everyone, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated because of how they looked. The true power of Judge Washington's actions that day wouldn't be fully understood until the plane landed and the consequences began to ripple outward, affecting not just one flight crew or one airline, but an entire industry's approach to dignity and respect. As Flight 2187 began its descent into Charlotte Douglas International Airport, no one on board fully understood the magnitude of what awaited them. The captain had announced an emergency landing with no further explanation, leaving passengers checking their watches and calculating connection times. They had no idea they were about to become witnesses to a moment that would transform an entire industry. Through the windows, passengers could see what was clearly not a routine landing. Emergency vehicles lined the runway. Not ambulances or fire trucks, but black SUVs with tinted windows, corporate vehicles, government vehicles, media vans with satellite dishes extended. This wasn't a medical emergency or mechanical issue. This was something else entirely. As the aircraft taxied to its position and the jetway extended to meet it, Eleanor Washington remained perfectly still in her seat, her posture upright despite her still damp clothing. She had not spoken since her phone call with Chairwoman Richards, maintaining a dignified silence that somehow commanded more attention than any outburst could have. When the cabin door finally opened, it wasn't a gate agent who appeared in the doorway. It was Charles Hamilton, CEO of the airline, a man whose face regularly appeared in business magazines and Sunday morning talk shows. A man who had never in his 15-year tenure personally boarded a diverted aircraft. Yet here he was, his normally confident expression replaced by one of grave concern as he scanned the cabin until his eyes found Eleanor. Behind him stood two executives in dark suits, both carrying tablets and wearing expressions that communicated the severity of the situation. This wasn't damage control. This was crisis management at the highest level. "Judge Washington," Hamilton said, his voice carrying through the silent cabin. "On behalf of the entire airline, I extend our deepest apologies for what you experienced today." Before Eleanor could respond, her government phone rang. She answered it, activating the video function so that the face of Chairwoman Margaret Richards appeared on the screen. Richards, a formidable black woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing eyes, was visible not just to Eleanor, but to everyone nearby. "Judge Washington," Richards began, her authoritative voice carrying through the cabin. "I've ordered all fleet operations for the airline suspended until this situation is fully resolved. Every aircraft in their fleet is currently grounded." The collective gasp in the cabin was audible. Passengers who'd been irritated by a simple diversion now realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in commercial aviation history. Meredith, who had been standing in stunned silence since the revelation of Eleanor's identity, finally found her voice. "You can't ground an entire airline," she protested, her tone somewhere between desperate and indignant. "There are thousands of passengers, hundreds of flights." CEO Hamilton turned to face her, his expression hardening. "She just did," he stated flatly. "The National Airline Association has regulatory authority that supersedes even FAA jurisdiction in certain matters. Chairwoman Richards doesn't need anyone's permission to ground our fleet if she believes there's a systemic safety or ethical concern." The reality of the situation began to spread through the cabin like a wave. Passengers who had been checking their watches were now watching the unfolding scene with dawning comprehension. Those who had participated in Eleanor's mistreatment through active comments or passive silence shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly understanding that they had been complicit in something that was now grounding an entire commercial airline. Eleanor rose from her seat, her dignity intact despite her disheveled appearance. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms of power. "This isn't about comfort or convenience," she addressed the entire cabin, her gaze sweeping across passengers and crew alike. "This is about human dignity, about the fundamental right of every person to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status." Her words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity and devastating in their truth. CEO Hamilton turned to Meredith, who stood frozen in the realization of what she had set in motion. "Miss Keller, your employment with this airline is terminated, effective immediately. Surrender your credentials to security before leaving the aircraft." The words were delivered without drama, but with finality that left no room for appeal. Meredith's face crumpled as 20 years of career security vanished in a single sentence. "But I didn't know," she began, tears welling in her eyes. "That's precisely the problem," Hamilton cut her off. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic human dignity. That this needs to be stated explicitly is exactly why we're in this situation." He was echoing Eleanor's own words from earlier, a sign that the lesson was already beginning to take root. Lead Flight Attendant Davis and the other crew members approached Eleanor one by one, offering profuse apologies. Their earlier solidarity with Meredith had evaporated, replaced by the desperate damage control of those who suddenly realize they're on the wrong side of history. "Judge Washington, I'm so sorry I didn't intervene," Davis said, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine remorse. "I should have stopped this immediately." Eleanor acknowledged his apology with a slight nod, but offered no absolution. This wasn't the time for easy forgiveness. This was the time for accountability and change. Most telling was the transformation in the passenger's demeanor. The businessman who had told Eleanor to just listen to the staff now stared intently at his phone, unable to meet her eyes. The woman who had smirked at Meredith's priority customer's comment now found her seatbelt fascinating. None of them could bring themselves to look directly at Eleanor. Not out of the earlier dismissal, but out of shame for their complicity, CEO Hamilton addressed the cabin again, his voice carrying the gravity of institutional accountability. "Effective immediately, our airline is launching a full investigation into our company culture, training protocols, and customer service standards. This incident has exposed failures at every level of our organization, and they will be addressed systematically and transparently." He turned to Eleanor. "Judge Washington, we would be grateful for your input on our reforms if you're willing to provide it." Eleanor's response was measured but firm. Discrimination isn't an isolated incident. It's systemic. It requires systemic solutions. She gestured around the cabin. What happened today wasn't just about one flight attendant's prejudice. It was about a culture that enabled that prejudice to be expressed without consequence. It was about passengers who witnessed discrimination and chose silence. It was about leadership that failed to create clear expectations about human dignity. The cabin remained silent as her words resonated with undeniable truth. In that moment, Judge Eleanor Washington wasn't just addressing one airline or one incident. She was articulating a fundamental principle that would soon reshape training programs, corporate policies, and industry standards across commercial aviation. Security personnel arrived to escort Meredith from the aircraft. As she passed Eleanor's seat, she stopped, her face streaked with tears. I never meant. I didn't realize. Eleanor met her gaze directly. Intent doesn't erase impact, Miss Keller. The harm was real, regardless of what you meant. It wasn't cruelty in Eleanor's voice, but the clear-eyed truth that had made her respected on the bench. Sometimes justice requires discomfort before healing can begin. As Meredith was escorted away, Chairwoman Richards spoke again from the video call still active on Eleanor's phone. Judge Washington, a car is waiting to take you to your final destination. Mr. Hamilton and his team will be spending the rest of the day explaining to their board of directors exactly how this happened and what they intend to do about it. The passengers, now fully understanding the gravity of what they had witnessed, began gathering their belongings in silence. The earlier complaints about delays had evaporated, replaced by the sobering realization that they had been part of something momentous, a tipping point in how dignity and respect would be defined in commercial travel. As Eleanor prepared to leave the aircraft, CEO Hamilton asked one final question. Judge Washington, may I ask, what made you finally make that call? After enduring so much mistreatment, what was the final straw? Eleanor paused, considering the question carefully. Her answer would later be quoted in training materials across the industry. When I was physically pushed and had water spilled on me, it crossed a line from disrespect to assault, she said. But the real moment came when I saw not a single person in this cabin speak up. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me, but about everyone who has ever been mistreated and had no recourse, no authority to call, no way to demand justice. She looked around the cabin one final time. I made that call for my grandmother who cleaned these planes, for the families in my housing discrimination case, for every person who has ever swallowed their dignity because speaking up seemed too costly. As Eleanor Washington walked off Flight 2187, she left behind not just a cabin of chastened passengers and crew, but the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through an entire industry. Sometimes justice arrives not in courtrooms, but at 30,000 FT when the right person is pushed too far and finally says enough. 1 month after Judge Eleanor Washington's confrontation on Flight 2187, the impact of that singular moment had expanded far beyond one airline, one flight attendant, or one passenger's experience. What began as a routine flight had triggered a seismic shift across the entire commercial aviation industry. The transformation wasn't happening in the shadows. It was playing out on a national stage with cameras rolling as chairwoman. Margaret Richards and Judge Eleanor Washington stood side by side at a press conference at the National Airline Association headquarters in Washington, D.C. Today marks a new chapter in commercial aviation, Richards declared to the assembled press corps. One where dignity isn't a luxury afforded to some passengers, but a fundamental right guaranteed to all. Beside her, Eleanor stood in her judicial robes, not because this was a legal proceeding, but because the symbolism mattered. The authority that had been invisible to Meredith and the passengers of Flight 2187 was now unmistakable, a visual reminder of the power that had always been present, even when unrecognized. Together, they unveiled the new Passenger Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive training program that would be mandatory for every airline employee across all major carriers. The program wasn't just about avoiding discrimination. It was about actively recognizing and honoring the humanity in every passenger. This initiative represents the largest coordinated training effort in aviation history. Richards explained, every employee from CEOs to gate agents will complete this program within the next 6 months. What made the initiative unique wasn't just its scale, but its approach. It wasn't created by corporate consultants or public relations experts trying to minimize damage. It was designed by a diverse committee of aviation professionals, civil rights experts, and passengers who had experienced discrimination firsthand. Most surprising to many was the inclusion of Meredith Keller among the program's developers. The flight attendant, whose actions had triggered the entire movement, had undergone her own transformation. In her first public interview since the incident, Meredith spoke with remarkable candor about her journey. I never thought about my own biases until that day, she admitted, her voice steady but humbled. I always considered myself a good person who treated everyone equally. But watching the footage of how I behaved toward Judge Washington forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. She paused, emotion visible on her face. The hardest part wasn't losing my job. It was recognizing that for 20 years, I might have been treating people differently based on how they looked, without ever acknowledging it to myself. Her words resonated with viewers across the country, sparking conversations in living rooms and workplaces about the invisible biases that shape everyday interactions. Her journey from perpetrator to advocate became a powerful case study in how confronting discrimination could lead to genuine growth. Meanwhile, in a grand ballroom at the National Judicial Conference, Eleanor Washington took the stage to address her colleagues. Hundreds of federal judges from across the country. The audience fell silent as she approached the podium. Her reputation now expanded beyond her legal acumen to include her role in transforming an industry. "My fellow judges," she began, "we often speak of justice as something that happens in our courtrooms. We put on our robes, we take the bench, we hear arguments, and we render decisions that become precedent." She paused, surveying the room filled with the nation's most powerful jurists. But on Flight 21A7, I was reminded that justice isn't confined to courtrooms. It exists or fails to exist in everyday moments. In how a flight attendant serves water, in how a passenger shifts away from their seatmate, in the silence of witnesses who see wrong but say nothing. As Eleanor spoke, images appeared on the screens behind her. Not of courtrooms or legal documents, but of her grandmother, Idem Washington, in her cleaning uniform beside a commercial aircraft in the 1960s. The photograph, grainy but powerful, showed a dignified woman standing tall despite the era's pervasive discrimination. "My grandmother cleaned these planes," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying emotion rarely displayed on the bench. "She straightened her uniform each day, insisting on her own dignity, even when others refused to see it. She told me, they might not respect the uniform, but I respect myself in it." The images transitioned to contemporary photographs of diverse flight crews. Black, Hispanic, Asian, Muslim women in hijabs, all standing proudly in their uniforms beside modern aircraft. Today, because one woman was finally pushed too far, these aviation professionals don't just clean the planes. They fly them, they captain them. They own the companies that operate them. And most importantly, they are seen. Truly seen by the industry they serve. "Justice isn't passive," Eleanor concluded, her voice resonating through the ballroom. "Sometimes it requires grounding an entire industry to elevate humanity. Sometimes it requires using the authority we've earned to speak forth those who haven't yet been given a voice." Her final words would be quoted in law schools and corporate training programs for years to come. The true measure of justice isn't what happens when everyone knows who you are. It's what happens when no one knows who you are and you're treated with dignity. Anyway, 2 months after Flight 2187, Judge Eleanor Washington boarded another plane, this time for a well-deserved vacation. As she approached the aircraft, she was greeted by a diverse flight crew, each member making respectful eye contact as they welcomed her aboard. "Good afternoon, ma'am. It's an honor to have you with us today," the lead flight attendant said. Not because she recognized Eleanor as the judge who had transformed their industry, but because this was now how all passengers were greeted, with genuine respect that acknowledged their inherent dignity. As Eleanor settled into her seat, she noticed the small placard now displayed in every seat pocket alongside the safety information on this aircraft. "Every passenger deserves equal respect and dignity. If you experience or witness any form of discrimination, please alert our crew immediately. We are committed to a journey that honors everyone's humanity. If you love this story, like and hit the subscribe button and share to others so they can learn too."